Our stories shape us. What we experience and how we interpret what we experience shapes how we see the world, see ourselves, and what we're going to try to do to survive and even thrive. Dr. Larry Crabb spoke of 3 levels to our life story. There's the external story, and that's just the people and the events that have shaped the narrative. Then there's the internal story, which relates to how we've made sense of all the things that have happened. And part of becoming self-aware is learning about this part of our story, our hidden motives, the ways we cope with life, the things we often don't realize we believe. But then there's the transcendent story, the story God is writing into our lives, the divine perspective on where we've come from and where we're headed. So think about a little girl named Miriam. Egypt was old by the time her story took place. Even the pyramids were showing signs of aging. Egypt was easily the world power of its day, with a magnificent culture and great military power, technological advances, beautiful art, sophisticated society. And against this backdrop of luxury and wealth, Miriam was born. But she was born into a slave family, living during a particularly brutal time in the history of her people, because Egyptians ruthlessly subjugated Hebrews. And it's against this backdrop that we meet Miriam, who was probably around 8 or 9 years old, a 3rd grader, when we read about her in Exodus. Picture this young couple, Amram and Jochebed. They're God-fearing, they're living in poverty, they have a growing family. And as a member of the enslaved people, Miriam had probably worked hard most of her little life already and helped her father and mother keep the household going. And you can imagine maybe the external events of her life. Little food, harsh treatment from Egyptian people, long, hard days of labor. How did that shape her life? In a desperate attempt to save Moses' life, Jochebed left her little 3rd grader to watch the floating basket among the reeds of the crocodile and snake and hippopotamus-infested Nile with its precious little cargo. Jochebed had to go to work, as did Amram. And we know how resourceful and courageous little Miriam was, setting the trajectory of Moses' life as well as hers, with a quick thinking and a winning way with the Egyptian royal. So what I'd like you to do now is to think about your own story. Think about the experiences that have shaped you. And let's just think about the events and the people right now, everything that's happened outside, the external story. And you're going to need a partner for this. So please think of someone that you could spend some time with to talk about your story and their story. And honestly, the external story is the most comfortable domain to think about. It involves your current concerns. So what's going on in your present life right now? Just think about your day-to-day life. What's expected of you? What are you responsible for? And then I want you to think of your roles as a daughter or son, as a parent, as a sibling. Perhaps you're a partner or a spouse or an in-law. Maybe you're a church member or a worker or a friend. And now think of your seasons. Think of the holidays and think of your own season of life. And maybe the next category would be problems and tragedies and trials, difficulties, calamities that have happened. But also there are peak experiences, rites of passage, entering into new seasons of life or exciting things that have happened. Think about getting your first job. Well, think of the death of someone near to you or a death of a pet. Think of weddings and births and divorces and coming of age. How about your historical data? It's positive and negative. Schooling, wealth or lack thereof, culture, background, the position you had in your family growing up. Maybe you were the oldest child or the middle or the youngest. Maybe you were an only child, the only daughter or only son. Think of the jobs you've had, volunteering you've done, maybe churches you've gone to or clubs, but also think about your hobbies and your interests, your side hustles, your talents, and of course your personality traits and your character. Think of the feelings that are related to the events. Maybe someone got married and you were very excited, or maybe you were jealous. Now that's just a feeling. It's part of your external story. So you can have great feelings or not so great feelings, but your feelings are your feelings and they're part of your story. What words would you choose? Think about your most vivid childhood memories. If you were to describe yourself as a child, what did you look like to other people? Think of your physical description or activities or how you acted around people. And then pick significant events in your life so far, positive and negative. how did those events shape the circumstances in your life? Now, you can see crossroads in your life. And so maybe something happened and you realized, oh, I'm going to go in this direction instead of that one. Now, how would other people describe your life? How would they describe you as a kid? How would they describe you today? Take the next 5 minutes and just write about these things. Hit pause, and when you're ready, lift pause and we'll do the next thing. Okay, you're ready to practice listening to each other. So here's how to do it. Ask good leading questions, like what happened next? Or tell me more about, or how did that make you feel? Or what did the other people do? Or how does that tie in with your life today? Now here, this is really important. Only listen. If you're the person who's the listener, only listen. Give good receipts or good responses. Give sympathy where appropriate, warmth, understanding. For example, gosh, that sounds hard, or that sounds happy, or that sounds poignant, or that must have hurt, or helped, or felt good, or felt bad, whatever. Don't give advice. Don't judge. Don't try to retell the story, and don't tell your own story. You're the listener. So give each other about 5 minutes apiece to tell your story. In other words, 5 minutes for one person to tell their story and the other person to listen well. Then switch. And then the listener now becomes the storyteller. And the first storyteller now becomes the listener. So hit pause. And when you're ready, we'll go into the next level of story. We'll have to use our imagination to try to discern Miriam's internal story. On the outside, we can see a resourceful, courageous girl growing up to be a prophet and a national leader. In a decidedly patriarchal culture, the Bible says God purposely selected these 3 siblings to lead God's people across the Sinai desert to the land God had promised them in Canaan. She must have been a remarkable woman. But what about her internal story? How did the trauma of slavery and the plagues and the arduous years in the desert shape her? Our only window into her soul are the circumstances surrounding her being stricken suddenly and disastrously with leprosy. It was as though God had turned her inside out, and the old festering wounds were now visible to everyone, including her. Leprosy, killing her from the inside out. You know, I actually feel an affinity for Miriam. She had found a way to cope with the pain of slavery, the pain of mistreatment, of not really getting to have a childhood, but having to grow up very early, and she learned how to do all things well. She was large and in charge. She learned how to perform well, and she knew her duty. But I wonder how loved Miriam felt. I wonder if she had made an early vow to never be vulnerable. I wonder if she jealously guarded her position as a leader with her 2 brothers on either side. And I wonder if she looked for affirmation from her role as a prophet. Think about your own longings. Then think about your strategies for fulfilling your longings, even though you may sense that some of your strategies have not been the right way. As you think about your external story, what did you decide must be true about you, or about the other people, or about people in general? What recurring themes might there be of conflict or frustration, or of a certain kind of problem? How deeply do you connect to those memories? How well do your emotions match the facts of the story? Pay attention to your feelings related to external events. If you feel numb about things other people would be emotional about, this probably tells you something about your internal world. And by the same token, if you are more emotional about an event or situation than most others would be, this also can tell you something about your internal story. If you see the same reoccurring problem, consider if there's some internal connection not being resolved. So an internal story includes how you've made sense of the external events of your life, vows that you've made and beliefs that have formed over the course of your life, deep longings, what you do to deal with internal pain, positive and negative ways, how you've learned to navigate life. What's your life philosophy? What are your values? What's your worldview? Oftentimes, we can't really even tell what our worldview is. We think we know what we believe, but if you watch how you live your life, that will tell you what you really believe. So what do you really believe? This is the part most of us skip, Especially us Christians, we like to skip straight from the external story to the transcendent story, what God's doing, without really taking a close look at our internal story. We leave ourselves in the dark. Often, it helps to ask someone else, someone who's wise, someone who's able to ask good questions and who's able to empathize with you, to help you examine your internal world. Proverbs 20, verse 5 says, "The purposes of one's heart are deep waters, but someone of understanding draws them out." So often, you and I are not in touch with what really motivates us, or why we like some things or some people but don't like other things or other people. Have you ever promised yourself you'll never lose another argument? Or you will always do what it takes to get the job done? Or maybe you'll never let yourself get hurt again. Maybe you grew up being doted on by a loving parent and now you're searching for that special someone who will love you like that. Or maybe you grew up often being denied and you've promised yourself, now that you're in charge, you will make sure you get to have those things. Maybe a traumatic loss in life has you hanging on to what's left with all you've got. Or maybe you find yourself looking for that next crazy experience, half in fear but also secretly half excited. Do you love drama? Maybe you'll never admit it? Or will you do whatever it takes to keep everyone happy and quiet and not arguing? So take 5 minutes to think deeply about the way you approach life. Hit pause, and when you're ready, we'll move on. All right, give each other 5 minutes to tell your story and ask good questions. Remember about good listening, and then asking things like, what vow did you make? What life lessons did you take to heart? How do you see the world now? Remember to only listen, give good responses, and don't give advice or judge or try to retell that person's story or tell your own story. Hit pause. When you're ready, we'll move on. It is actually breathtaking when you think about it, how God lifted a little enslaved girl out of obscurity and into fame so enduring. We talk about her a good 4,000 years later. Slavery didn't break her. It shaped her character to be strong and hardy, to be brave, to not fear pain or suffering or hardship. She knew what it was to make life and death decisions, even as a child. She grew wise, and her ear was tuned to God's voice, as all prophets' ears must be. And Miriam's Transcendent Story is about God using everything in her life, hardship as well as the love of her parents and their love and reverence for God. God gave Miriam increasing opportunity to live by faith, to speak out God's word, and to do what was right. And because God loved Miriam, God gave her leprosy. And we don't hear much about Miriam after that story, but I'd like to think her week alone outside the camp gave her time to think about what God had said to Moses in response to Moses' intercession for Miriam. Now, I hope you go back and really read that story. The words God said sound harsh, but I like to think that what stuck in Miriam's mind was the imagery of leprosy eating her alive. The Lord likened what God had done to Miriam as what a father would have done with his defiant daughter. Miriam would have understood that a father only bothers to discipline the ones he loves, the ones he considers as his own, those worth investing in. Who she was mattered to God, and what was happening to her inside was a life and death matter to God. She knew God had already forgiven her. She knew God would restore her in 7 days. But most of all, she knew she mattered this much to God. Now, living a transcendent story means that my story is part of something much bigger, God's story, God's purposes, and God's plan. So as you think through your external and internal stories, ask your own God questions. Why did God put me in my family, the one you grew up in and the one you're in now? How do I fit my story into the context of my growing up experiences? Why did God design me this way? How do my talents and my proclivities and my skills and so on, how does that all fit into God's grand design? What has God already accomplished through me? And how do the details of my life point to God at work? And then ask someone to help you examine your internal world. Now, this person, I'm hoping, is the person you picked to do this whole workshop with. The Transcendent Story includes a growing awareness of God's presence, even in extremely hard circumstances. It involves movement beyond using your internal and external story to define you, which really means to limit you. An ability to take risks because you see God as integrally involved and protective. A growing desire to reach out to others in relationships and to be less concerned with what I'm getting out of it. Less reliance on other people, be it a counselor or a spouse or a mentor, a parent, a child, a friend, whoever it is, to save you or give your life ultimate meaning. Becoming a unique person, more aware of yourself as God's image bearer than as someone with passionate longing. And also as one who is imperfectly living out your calling to relate to and reflect the one whose image you bear. You view God as less someone you need to rely on to be useful, and more worthy of worship as you move towards your transcendent story. So now I want you to take 5 minutes to think through how God has woven together your story into God's great meta-narrative. Hit the pause and then lift it when you're ready to move on. And now give each other 5 minutes to tell your story and ask good questions. When you're the listener, say, where was God in this? Ask, how do you think God was transforming you? What are you doing now with the story God is giving you? Remember to really listen well. Listen for that transcendent story. Ask good questions. Remember not to judge. Remember not to tell your own story or try to retell the other person's story or give advice or any of those things. Just listen well. I hope you discovered something new about yourself and about the people you did this workshop with. But most importantly, I hope you gained perspective on the transcendent story God is writing into your life and through you into the lives of others. This workshop has been crafted for the Lay Counselor Institute from Dr. Crabb's conception of the 3-level story and in collaboration with Cindy Hunter and the Lay Counselor Institute.